kindness of a monster.
Before we begin this chilling story, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon and let me know in the comments what you liked about the story.
I remember the day like it was yesterday, though it's been over 50 years since it happened. You don't forget something like that. You can't. It gets carved into your bones, into the core of who you are. I still see the snowflakes falling that day, hear the laughter of my family echoing through the forest, the warmth of my parents' faces, and then the silence. The crushing silence that followed. It was supposed to be a perfect family trip. A winter getaway to the mountains, to disconnect, to breathe. The world was a simpler place back then. No cell phones, no internet, just snow, pine trees, and the steady breath of the wind rolling through the mountains. The kind of trip where you could lose yourself in the peace of it all. My dad had rented a cabin deep in the woods, right on the edge of a national forest. He loved the wilderness. So did I, though I was only 8 at the time and didn't really know what that love meant. All I knew was that when we got there, with the cabin's chimney puffing out smoke into the cold air and the sun setting behind the mountains, everything felt magical. Mom had packed too much food, as she always did. My sister Mary was just starting to act like a teenager, which meant rolling her eyes at everything. But I could see the excitement in her too, even if she'd never admit it. We'd spent the first day sledding down the hills near the cabin, snowball fights, building lopsided snowmen. I remember the way my dad looked at us, like he was proud, like he'd created this perfect little world, and maybe he had. We were happy. The kind of happiness you don't notice at the time because it feels so normal, so right. But it wasn't meant to last. I don't know why I wandered off. I guess I was just playing. Kids do that, right? I was chasing my own footprints, hopping from one to the next, deeper into the trees. There was no fear. I didn't feel lost, not at first. It was a game. I was going to surprise them by coming out of the woods from a different direction. Then I tripped. I fell face first into the snow. A sharp pain shot through my ankle, and when I tried to stand, it collapsed beneath me. I tried not to panic, but something was wrong. I knew it the moment I couldn't put any weight on it. I was only a few minutes from the cabin, but when you're 8 alone and the sun is starting to dip below the horizon, those few minutes feel like miles. I screamed for my parents, for Mary. I screamed until my throat hurt. Nothing. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. I sat there crying, clutching my ankle, the cold seeping into my bones. That's when the snow started falling heavier, thick flakes piling up on the ground around me, covering my tracks. I tried to stand again, hopping on my good leg, but it was no use. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. I don't remember much after that. Maybe it was the cold, maybe it was the pain, but at some point I blacked out. When I woke up, it was dark. I wasn't outside anymore. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Earthy, damp, like the inside of a cave or a hollowed-out tree. My body ached. My ankle throbbed. When I tried to move, I felt the scratch of something rough against my skin, animal furs draped over me like a blanket. My heart raced. Where was I? What had happened? I looked around. It was hard to see in the dim light, but the room, or cave, or whatever it was small. The walls were jagged, rough stone, but there were strange markings carved into them, like scratches or symbols I couldn't understand. And there, sitting by a smoldering fire, was the thing that saved me. At first I thought it was human, a man, maybe. But as my eyes adjusted to the flickering light, I realized it wasn't. Not really. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over its bones. It looked like it had once been a man, long ago, but something had gone wrong. Its face was elongated with a mouth full of sharp, yellowed teeth. Its eyes were black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck in the light from the fire. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature didn't move. It just sat there watching me, its head tilted slightly to one side. Then it spoke, though its lips barely moved. "You're hurt," it said. Its voice was low, gravelly, but not entirely inhuman. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing with every horror story my dad had ever told us about the mountains, about the things that lived out there in the deep woods, far from civilization. The creature stood up slowly, its joints creaking like old wood. It towered over me, at least 7 feet tall, and moved with a strange, unnatural grace. It crouched beside me, and I flinched, but it didn't touch me. Instead, it reached for my ankle, examining it with long, clawed fingers. "Broken," it said simply. I closed my eyes, praying it would just kill me quickly, but it didn't. It stood up again, moved to the other side of the room, and came back with something in its hand, a piece of rough wood, like a makeshift splint. Without a word, it began to bind my ankle, using strips of cloth to tie the splint in place. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting for it to make a move to show its true intentions, but it never did. It just helped me, kept me warm, fed me scraps of meat I didn't want to think too hard about. Days passed. I couldn't walk, and there was no way I could find my way back to the cabin, even if I could have. The creature, my savior, my captor, never left my side. I remember the search, or rather, I remember the story of it. I wasn't there, not really, but I've heard it told in fragments over the years, whispered in hushed voices at family gatherings, in drunken confessions from my dad when he thought I couldn't hear. I've pieced it together like fitting shards of broken glass into a puzzle that will never quite be whole. The search started almost immediately. I hadn't been gone long before my mom started calling my name, thinking I was just hiding somewhere close by. She was never the kind of mom who let things slide. She always kept a close eye on me and Mary. I can still hear her voice in my head sometimes, calling out over the snow, her words mixing with the wind. "Tommy, Tommy, where are you?" I'd always come running when she called, except this time I didn't. At first, my parents didn't panic. It was a game, after all. We were in the mountains, sure, but we were close to the cabin, and kids wander. I was a curious 8-year-old boy. How far could I have gone? They looked around the nearby trees, calling my name louder and louder, their voices growing more frantic with each passing minute. My sister Mary, who was 12 at the time and full of teenage indifference, probably rolled her eyes, thinking I was just being a little brat. But even she started to get nervous after the first hour. An hour. That's how long it took for my dad to realize something was wrong. Really wrong. He stopped calling. He stopped smiling. The look on his face changed from frustration to cold fear. That primal, gut-level fear that every parent dreads but hopes they never have to feel. He told my mom to take Mary back to the cabin while he searched a little further. Just a little further. He'd find me. He had to. They searched for hours that first day, calling my name until their voices were hoarse, scouring the area around the cabin, retracing every step we'd taken that morning. My dad was methodical, logical. He marked off sections of the woods as if I were a lost set of keys, something he could eventually stumble across. But the sun was going down, and the temperature was dropping. The first night came too quickly, and with it the bitter cold of the mountain. When darkness fell, they had no choice but to go back to the cabin and call for help. The rescue teams arrived the next morning. At first, it was just the local rangers and a few volunteers from the nearest town, a couple of men with rugged faces and thick winter coats, looking as if they'd seen it all before. Missing kids in the mountains weren't common, but they weren't unheard of either. A lot of them turned up within a few hours, cold and scared, but alive. That's what everyone expected. That's what my parents clung to at first. They searched the areas my dad had already combed, going deeper into the woods, their voices ringing through the trees, echoing off the mountainsides. My mom was back at the cabin, pacing, her breath fogging up the windows as she stared out into the wilderness, waiting for someone to walk up that snow-covered path with me in tow. She kept the fire going, kept extra blankets ready. She refused to leave even when they tried to convince her to go back to town for the night. I heard that the first real clue showed up 2 days into the search. They found a single footprint, a small one. It was nearly buried under fresh snow, but the search dogs had led them to it. That footprint, the mark of my right boot, was proof that I had gone deeper into the woods. Not back toward the cabin like they had hoped. The print gave them hope. It was something at least, and the search area was extended even further. But after that footprint, there was nothing, no more tracks, no trail. It was like I had simply vanished into the snow. By the third day, the storm hit. It was a bad one, even by mountain standards. A blizzard that swept in fast, bringing with it a wall of wind and snow that turned everything white. The search teams had to pull back. It was too dangerous to stay out there, too easy for someone else to get lost. That's when things started to change. There's a point in every search where hope begins to fade. It starts small, like a seed of doubt, growing slowly with every passing hour, every empty-handed return. But it's there, gnawing at the edges of your mind. By the end of that third day, the seed had taken root. My parents were staying in the cabin while the search teams used it as their base of operations. Rangers came and went, men with grim faces, speaking in low tones when they thought no one was listening. My mom overheard them. She heard the word hypothermia. She heard the numbers, the odds, the cold calculations of survival rates in those kinds of conditions. She broke down. My dad tried to stay strong for her, for Mary, but I think he knew too. He just wouldn't admit it. Not yet. On the fourth day, when the storm finally let up, they found the blood. It was small, just a few droplets on the snow, but enough to catch someone's eye. The snow had started to melt slightly in the midday sun, revealing what had been hidden beneath the fresh powder. The blood wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Maybe a day or two at most. They followed the trail, a few drops here, a few there, scattered and inconsistent. The search dogs picked up on it immediately, their noses to the ground, leading the team deeper into the forest, into areas they hadn't searched before. That's when they found the second footprint. This time, it was my left boot. The blood and the footprints together told a story, one that made my parents' hearts ache with both hope and dread. I was alive, or at least I had been alive after the storm. But I was hurt, injured, bleeding, and God knew what else. The search shifted. It was no longer just a missing person case. It was a rescue mission, a race against time, and everyone knew it. They brought in more people, more equipment, thermal imaging cameras, helicopters flying overhead. The local news started covering it. The whole town came out to help, braving the cold and the unforgiving terrain to find me. But every night my parents went to bed in that empty cabin, huddled together for warmth, the silence stretching out between them. My mom cried herself to sleep. My dad lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he had let me slip through his fingers. They kept following the blood trail, hoping it would lead to me. But the trail was erratic, disappearing for long stretches, only to reappear again 100 yards later. It was as if I had been stumbling through the woods, leaving small markers of my passing, but never enough for them to catch up. After a week, the media started whispering the unthinkable, people in town too. The whispers turned to rumors, the rumors to outright suspicion. No one said it directly to my parents, but the doubt was there. How could an 8-year-old survive that long in those conditions? And if I was out there, bleeding and lost, why hadn't they found more? Why hadn't the blood trail led to something more definitive? A body, a campsite, a clue? They didn't know. No one knew. Then the cabin was raided. It was a week and a half into the search, and everyone had gone home for the night. My parents were asleep, Mary curled up in a chair trying to make sense of what was happening. And then sometime in the early hours of the morning, someone or something broke into the cabin. It was subtle at first, just a creak on the porch. My mom was the first to wake, her senses sharp from days of living in a state of perpetual fear. She thought it was one of the rangers, or maybe someone from the search party. But when she glanced at the window, she saw nothing, just the darkness and the trees swaying in the wind. Then the back door opened, just a crack. My mom's breath caught in her throat. She nudged my dad awake, her heart pounding in her chest. He grabbed a flashlight, his hands shaking, and quietly made his way to the back of the cabin. He thought it might be an animal, maybe a bear looking for food. But when he reached the door, he found nothing but footprints. Small, human-like footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. But there was something wrong with them. They weren't mine. They were too big, too elongated, like someone had been walking on the balls of their feet, their toes splayed unnaturally wide. It was as if something had been walking in the shape of a human, but wasn't quite right. My dad knew what he saw. He never admitted it to anyone but me years later when he'd had too much to drink. He knew those weren't my footprints. But at the time, he was desperate. Desperate to believe that I was still alive, that I had somehow come back to the cabin and wandered off again, lost in the dark. The search continued with more intensity, more fear. People in town started talking about the strange things they'd seen in the woods over the years. Dark figures, shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. Old stories passed down through generations about the mountains being haunted by something ancient, something that lived in the deepest parts of the forest, far from the eyes of man. But my parents didn't care about stories. They just wanted their son back. Days turned into weeks. The blood trail eventually ran cold. The footprints disappeared. The hope of finding me alive grew thinner with every passing day until it was little more than a flicker, barely enough to see by. My parents had to make the decision that no parent ever wants to make. The search was officially called off. The rangers packed up their gear. The volunteers went home. The snow fell again, covering up any remaining traces of my passing, burying me in the memory of that mountainside. But my family didn't leave, not right away. They stayed for a few more days, holding on to whatever last shred of hope they could find. My mom refused to leave the cabin. She sat by the window, staring out into the trees, waiting for me to come back. My dad stood outside, smoking cigarette after cigarette, his face a mask of defeat. Eventually, though, they had to go home. They had to face the reality that I wasn't coming back, not the way they wanted me to, anyway. Meanwhile, I was still alive. Barely. I didn't know it at the time, but I was in the hands of something far worse than the cold. I'd been found, yes, but not by anyone who cared about getting me back to safety. The skinwalker had taken me, pulled me from the edge of death, and brought me into its world. A world of dark caves and silent forests, where the rules of men didn't apply. And it wasn't letting me go, not ever. While my family's hope was crumbling under the weight of loss and despair, I was living another life. A life they couldn't have imagined in their worst nightmares. I don't remember exactly when I regained full consciousness after the skinwalker took me, but I do remember the unbearable cold that seemed to press in from all sides. The kind of cold that gnawed at your bones, not just your skin. The small cave, dimly lit by the embers of a dying fire, was a stark contrast to the bustling warmth of the cabin I had been in not so long ago. I was surrounded by silence, except for the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional low growl from the creature watching me. The pain in my ankle was blinding at first. When I tried to move, it was as if knives were being driven into my leg. I winced, biting back the scream rising in my throat, and that's when I saw it. Sitting across from me, hunched over on all fours, its dark eyes gleaming in the firelight. I don't think I understood what it was then. Maybe I didn't want to. It looked human, but not quite. Too tall, too gaunt. Its limbs were unnaturally long. Its skin stretched taut over bones that jutted out in odd angles. The skin itself was pale, almost gray, like something long dead, but its eyes were alive. Very much alive. Black pits, almost gleaming in the darkness, and it was staring at me. For a long time, neither of us moved. I was frozen in place, half from fear, half from the pain of my injury. And then it spoke, or at least, I think it did. The words came from its mouth, but they didn't sound like anything a human voice should produce. They were guttural, low, like the wind itself was forming the sounds. "Stay still," it rasped, its voice more like a growl than anything human. "You're hurt." I didn't know what to say, didn't know if I even could speak at that moment. My throat was tight, choked with fear. But the creature didn't move closer. It just watched, observed. And then, as if it had decided something, it began to wrap my ankle. Roughly. With old tattered cloth and pieces of wood it must have found somewhere. Its movements were methodical, careful, but there was no comfort in it. No tenderness, just survival. I lost track of time in that cave. Days bled into one another. The storm outside raged on, and I could hear the wind howling through the trees like the mournful wails of some ancient beast. My body ached constantly, my ankle throbbing beneath the crude splint the creature had made for me. But I was alive. Somehow, I was still alive. The skinwalker, because by then I had no doubt what it was, never spoke again after that first night. It wasn't interested in conversation. It was interested in me, though. Watching. Always watching. I think in some twisted way it saw me as its responsibility, maybe even its possession. It never hurt me, not directly, but it didn't let me leave either. Sometimes it would leave the cave, disappearing into the snowstorm for hours or days at a time, only to return with food. The first time it brought me meat, I almost gagged. It smelled off, rancid even, but I was starving and the skinwalker shoved it toward me as if to say, eat or die. So I ate. I had no idea what it was. I didn't want to know. My stomach turned with every bite, but hunger won out over fear. At night, I could hear strange noises outside the cave. Not just the wind, but something else. Things moving through the trees. Sometimes I thought I heard voices, faint, far-off whispers that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I tried to ignore them, but every night they seemed to get louder, closer. Meanwhile, back in town, the rumors were spreading. Word had gotten out about the blood trail, about the strange footprints found near the cabin. People started whispering about the old legends again. Stories they'd heard from their grandparents passed down through generations. Stories about the things that lived in the mountains. Things that could take the form of animals or humans. Things that fed on fear and flesh. The word skinwalker was on everyone's lips, but no one dared say it out loud, not around my family. My mom was barely holding it together as it was. She had become a ghost of herself, pacing the halls of our house, staring out of the windows as if she still expected me to come walking down the street at any moment. My dad had thrown himself into the work. That was how he coped or pretended to. He couldn't stand to be in the house for too long. He didn't want to see the empty space at the dinner table and didn't want to hear my sister crying herself to sleep. So he worked. He buried his grief under long hours at the office or in the garage, fixing things that didn't need fixing. My sister Mary stopped going to school for a while. She couldn't handle the pitying looks, the way everyone treated her like she was broken. She lashed out at everyone, her friends, our parents, even herself. She blamed herself, I think, for not paying closer attention that day, for not seeing me wander off, for not hearing me when I screamed for help. None of them knew I was still alive. The search continued in the background, though it was less a rescue mission now and more an attempt to find a body. Something to give my parents closure. The military got involved after the first few weeks, but even they were met with nothing but dead ends. The weather was unforgiving. The snowstorms kept coming, blanketing the mountains in fresh layers of white that covered any possible signs of where I might have gone. And then there was the blood. They never told my parents, not directly, but one of the searchers let it slip to a local reporter that they had found more blood, farther out, deep into the woods. Too much blood. More than any 8-year-old boy could lose and still be alive. It painted a grim picture. They thought I had been attacked by an animal. A bear, maybe, or wolves. The evidence was there, after all. The broken branches, the disturbed snow, the bloodstains. But no body, and that's what kept them going. That's what kept the hope alive, even when it made no sense. There was nobody there. In the cave, I had become a shadow of myself. I was thin, weaker than I'd ever been, but somehow I had adapted. The pain in my ankle had dulled to a constant throb, but the skinwalker's makeshift splint had kept the bone in place enough for it to heal. I could walk, albeit with a limp. The creature had started taking me out with it into the forest. At first, I thought it was going to kill me or abandon me somewhere deep in the woods where no one would ever find me. But it didn't. Instead, it showed me things. How to track animals through the snow, how to find water beneath the ice, how to move quietly without disturbing the world around me. I became a part of the wilderness, a ghost, just like the skinwalker. But I never forgot my family. I thought about them every day. I imagined my mom's face, her smile, her laugh. I remembered the way my dad would ruffle my hair, the way Mary would tease me but always protect me when it really mattered. Those memories were what kept me going, even when the darkness of the cave and the cold of the mountain tried to smother me. Sometimes when the skinwalker was gone, I would try to run. I'd limp through the snow, following the trails I thought might lead me back to civilization. But it always found me, always dragged me back to that cave. Sometimes I thought I saw other things out there, shapes moving in the shadows, too fast and too large to be human. But they never came close. It was like they were afraid of the skinwalker, afraid of what it was, what it could do. The rumors in town grew wilder with each passing week. People claimed to have seen me out there in the woods with some kind of creature by my side. Some swore they'd heard my voice calling for help. But when they followed the sound, there was nothing. No one. The town was split. Some people believed I was still alive, that I had somehow survived, raised by whatever lived in those mountains. Others thought it was just a story, something the locals told each other to keep the mystery alive. But deep down, I think everyone knew. Something unnatural was happening in those woods, something that couldn't be explained. That's when the hunters came. They weren't the same as the search parties. These men weren't looking to bring me home. They weren't there to help. They were there to kill. They had heard the stories too, heard the whispers about the creature that lived in the mountains, and they wanted to be the ones who put it down. They came at night, moving through the forest with guns and knives, dressed in camouflage, their faces hard and cold. They were professionals. Mercenaries maybe, or just men with a taste for violence. I don't know. All I knew was that they were dangerous. I had seen them before they saw me. The skinwalker had taken me out to hunt, moving silently through the trees, when I spotted the glint of metal in the distance. The hunters were closing in, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run toward them, to tell them I was here, that I was still alive, that I needed help. But I didn't, because I knew they weren't here to save me. The skinwalker tensed beside me, its black eyes narrowing as it caught sight of the men. It let out a low growl, barely audible, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. "They've come for you," it said in that strange guttural voice, "and for me." I didn't understand. I didn't know why they would want me, but the skinwalker did, and it was ready to fight. The fight that followed was brutal. The hunters had come prepared. They knew what they were up against, or at least they thought they did. They moved with precision, surrounding the clearing where we stood, their rifles raised, their fingers on the triggers. But they didn't know the forest like we did. They didn't know how to move through the trees without making a sound, how to disappear into the shadows, how to use the snow to their advantage. The skinwalker was fast, faster than any of them could have imagined. It moved like a ghost, darting between the trees, its claws flashing in the moonlight. The first hunter went down before he even knew what hit him. His throat was torn open in a spray of blood. The others opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the forest, but they were too slow. I watched from the shadows, my heart in my throat, as the skinwalker tore through them one by one. It was savage, relentless, a force of nature that couldn't be stopped. But the hunters didn't give up. They fought back, and they fought hard. One of them managed to land a shot, the bullet tearing through the skinwalker's side, sending it crashing to the ground with a roar of pain. I wanted to run to it, to help it, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my body shaking with fear and adrenaline. The last hunter standing raised his rifle, aiming it at the fallen creature, ready to finish the job. But before he could pull the trigger, I acted. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation, but I lunged at him, grabbing his arm and throwing him off balance. He stumbled, his shot going wide, and the skinwalker took advantage of the moment. With a snarl, it leapt up, sinking its teeth into the man's neck, tearing him apart in a spray of blood and gore. His screams were cut short, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. And then it was over. The hunters were dead. The forest was silent once more, save for the labored breathing of the skinwalker as it slumped to the ground, blood pouring from its wounds. I rushed to its side, my heart racing, my hands trembling as I tried to stop the bleeding. But it was no use. The creature, my skinwalker, was dying. I could see it in its eyes, the way the light was fading from them. It looked at me, those black, soulless eyes staring into mine. And for the first time, I thought I saw something there, something human. As I knelt beside the skinwalker, the snow beneath us stained with its dark blood, I realized how much my life had changed. This creature, this thing that had once been a terrifying captor, was now the only constant in my world. As much as I wanted to hate it, to see it as the monster everyone said it was, I couldn't. It had saved me, fed me, kept me alive, and now it was dying. I pressed my hands against the gashes in its side, desperate to stop the bleeding, though I knew deep down that it was futile. The skinwalker's breaths were shallow, its body trembling in the cold air. Its once fierce eyes were dimming, the darkness in them flickering like a dying flame. I was crying. I hadn't even realized it, but tears were streaming down my face, freezing on my cheeks as I tried to hold the creature together to keep it from slipping away. "Please, don't go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. The skinwalker's head turned slightly, its lips curling in what almost looked like a smile. A twisted, broken smile, but a smile nonetheless. "It is time," it rasped, the words coming out in slow, painful breaths. I shook my head, refusing to accept it. "No, we can leave. I'll find help. We'll go far away from here and they won't find us. You don't have to die." But the creature only shook its head weakly. Its long fingers twitched, reaching out as if trying to touch my face. I leaned closer, feeling its icy breath on my skin as it whispered its final words. "You are free." And with that, the light in its eyes went out. Its body went still, the tension in its muscles easing as it slumped back into the snow. I stared at it for a long time, my chest heaving, my hands shaking as I clutched its lifeless form. I was alone again, just like before. But now, it was different. Now, I wasn't a scared little boy lost in the woods. Now, I was something else. Something changed. I don't know how long I stayed there, kneeling beside the skinwalker's body, the cold seeping into my bones. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just there, numb, empty. The storm had subsided, leaving the forest eerily quiet, the world around me painted in shades of white and red. Then I heard it, the sound of engines, low, distant at first, but growing louder. Helicopters, more than one. I knew what that meant. The government, the special forces, they had been watching, waiting. They knew the hunters wouldn't make it back, and now they were coming to finish what the hunters couldn't. I wanted to run. Every instinct in me screamed to get up, to flee into the forest, to disappear. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was too tired, too broken. Instead, I stayed there, sitting in the snow beside the skinwalker's body, my hands stained with its blood, and waited for them to find me. They came down from the skies like ghosts, silent, efficient, and cold. Men in black uniforms, faces covered by masks, their rifles trained on the trees as they moved in perfect formation. They spread out, their eyes scanning the area, their movements precise and deliberate. They weren't here to search. They were here to clean up. I barely looked up as they approached. I didn't flinch when they pointed their guns at me. I didn't even move when they circled the skinwalker's body, one of them kneeling down to inspect it while the others kept their weapons trained on me. "He's just a kid," one of them muttered, his voice distorted by the mask. "What the hell happened out here?" "Doesn't matter," another one said, his voice cold and emotionless. "He's coming with us." I was too exhausted to resist when they grabbed me, pulling me to my feet and leading me toward one of the helicopters. I didn't fight when they strapped me in, didn't say a word as the rotors roared to life and we lifted off into the sky. I just sat there staring down at the forest below, watching as the skinwalker's body grew smaller and smaller, eventually disappearing into the sea of trees. They didn't take me back to my family, not at first. They brought me somewhere else, a facility deep underground, where they asked me questions. So many questions. They wanted to know what I'd seen and what I'd experienced. They asked about the creature, about the hunters, about the blood trails and the footprints, but I didn't tell them much. I couldn't. Some of it was too hard to explain. The rest, well, I didn't think they'd believe me anyway. They weren't kind. They weren't cruel either. They were just detached, clinical, like I was another case file to be examined, another loose end to tie up. I spent days in that facility, maybe weeks, trapped in a sterile room with nothing but my thoughts for company. Eventually, they decided I wasn't a threat. Or maybe they just got bored. I was taken back to my family, to the house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, but now felt cold and foreign. My mom hugged me tighter than I'd ever been hugged before, sobbing into my shoulder as if she couldn't believe I was real. My dad stood there, his face a mixture of relief and guilt, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Mary, she didn't say much. She just looked at me, her eyes full of questions she'd never ask. They had their son back, but I wasn't the same boy who had wandered off into the woods all those months ago. I never would be. Years passed, I grew up, went to school, tried to live a normal life, as normal as I could. But there was always something different about me, something that set me apart from the others. I couldn't shake the memories of that cave, of the skinwalker's eyes watching me in the darkness, of the blood in the snow. I kept to myself. I didn't make friends easily. I didn't trust people the way I used to, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in those mountains, about the creature that had saved me, and what I had become because of it. I tried to forget, I tried to bury the memories, to move on, but the nightmares came, night after night, dragging me back to that frozen forest, to the blood and the violence, to the sounds of the wind whispering through the trees. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world was still, I'd hear it again, that low, guttural voice echoing in the back of my mind. You are free. But I wasn't. Not really. I'm old now, older than I ever thought I'd live to be. And I've seen enough of the world to know that it isn't the safe, orderly place we like to pretend it is. There are things out there, things older than us, things that don't fit neatly into our understanding of reality. The skinwalker was one of them. I don't know what it was, not exactly. Maybe it was once human, maybe it never was. But it found me and it changed me. I still dream about it sometimes, still hear its voice in the wind when I go for walks in the woods. I wonder if it's still out there in some form. Maybe, not that exact creature, but something like it. Something waiting in the shadows, watching, searching for the next lost soul to claim. I know people won't believe this story. They'll think it's just a tale, something I made up in my old age to explain the unexplainable. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe some things are better left forgotten. But I can't forget. I won't forget. Because I know the truth. I was the boy who walked into the woods. And I was the one who walked back out, but I was never the same again.